The mahogany hallway floorboards had never creaked before, or perhaps I had simply never noticed their complaints until the moment my entire world fractured into 1,000 irreparable shards. I stood frozen in the shadows of the foyer, a ghost in my own home, clutching a forgotten pair of prescription sunglasses that I had returned to retrieve. My chest felt tight, as if an invisible iron band were constricting my lungs, preventing the air from reaching them. From the living room, the voice of the man I had birthed, swaddled, and worshipped for 38 years drifted toward me, but the tone was unrecognizable. It was not the warm baritone of Julian, my beloved son. It was a cold, jagged sound, sharp with malice, and dripping with a triumphant arrogance that made my blood run cold. "It is done, Monica. The transfer cleared 30 seconds ago. $450,000. It is all sitting in the offshore account, safe and sound." The silence that followed was brief, broken only by a low, guttural laugh that I wished I could unhear. It was a sound of pure predation. I leaned heavily against the wall, the plaster cool against my cheek, trying to anchor myself as the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Julian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried perfectly in the quiet afternoon. "She has absolutely no idea. Mother is getting older. You know how it is. She trusts me to handle the heavy lifting. By the time she realizes the retirement fund is empty, we will be closing on the villa in Street Lucia. We'll tell her it was a market crash, a hacking incident, some bad investment algorithm. She barely knows how to use her smartphone. She'll believe whatever narrative I feed her. She always does. She is pathetic in her devotion, really." A sharp intake of breath caught in my throat. The woman he was speaking to, Monica, was my daughter-in-law of 3 years, a woman with porcelain skin and eyes that I had once thought were full of kindness, but now realized were merely mirrors reflecting whatever she needed people to see. They were talking about my life, my security. The $450,000 represented the culmination of 45 years of relentless labor as an interior architect. It was the money meant to ensure I would never be a burden, the safety net for my declining years, the legacy I had intended to leave ironically to him. I felt a physical blow to my stomach, a nausea so violent I had to cover my mouth to stifle a sob. This was not just theft, it was an annihilation of history. Julian was erasing me. He was not just taking my money, he was taking my dignity, my autonomy, and my past, treating me not as the woman who had sacrificed everything for his education and well-being, but as a senile obstacle to be circumvented. I should have stormed in there. I should have screamed, thrown the vase on the entry table, and demanded an explanation. But something primal and icy took hold of my nervous system. It was a survival instinct I hadn't utilized since I was a young widow navigating a male-dominated construction industry in the 80s. If I confronted him now, with no proof, he would spin it. He would gaslight me. He would look at me with those deceptive puppy-dog eyes and tell me I was hearing things, that my mind was slipping, using my 72 years as a weapon to discredit my reality. Slowly, agonizingly, I backed away. Every step was a calculated risk. I moved with the stealth of a burglar in the home I had bought and paid for, retreating out the front door and closing it with a softness that defied the screaming rage inside my head. Once I was inside my car, parked down the street, the dam broke. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, gasping for air as hot tears streamed down my face, blurring the vision of the suburban street. I wept for the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. I wept for the teenager I had tutored through calculus. I wept for the man I had walked down the aisle, beaming with pride. They were all dead. They had been murdered in the last 5 minutes by the stranger in my living room, who viewed me as a mark to be conned. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the neighborhood, the tears stopped. The grief calcified into something harder, sharper. I wiped my face with a rough tissue and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The eyes staring back were red-rimmed and weary, yes, but they were also the eyes of Eleanor Vance. I had built skyscrapers. I had managed multi-million-dollar budgets. I had raised a child alone after my husband, David, died of an aneurysm when Julian was 10. I was not a victim. I was a survivor. And I would be damned if I let my own flesh and blood turn me into a cautionary tale of elder abuse. I started the engine. I needed a plan. I needed an ally. And most importantly, I needed to be smarter than the two vultures picking at the carcass of my financial life. I drove straight to the home of Lydia Thorne. Lydia had been my best friend since our days at university. She was a retired litigation attorney with a mind like a steel trap and a tolerance for nonsense that hovered around zero. When she opened her door and saw my disheveled state, she didn't ask questions. She simply pulled me inside and poured 2 glasses of stiff scotch. I told her everything. I recounted the conversation word for word, the tone, the laughter, the plan to blame a market crash. Lydia listened with a stillness that was terrifying. She didn't interrupt, didn't gasp. She sat in her leather armchair, her eyes narrowing into slits as her mind began to dismantle the legal situation. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. Lydia took a slow sip of her drink and set the glass down with a deliberate clink. "That parasitic little monster," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He thinks because he has power of attorney that he has a license to steal. He is about to learn the difference between authority and ownership." "What do I do, Lydia?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "He transferred everything. It's gone." "It is not gone, Eleanor," she corrected me sharply. "It is moved. There is a paper trail. Money does not vanish. It travels, and we are going to track it down. But first, you have to do the hardest performance of your life." I looked at her, confused. "Performance?" "You have to go back there," Lydia said, leaning forward. "You have to go home, cook dinner, and smile at him. You cannot let him know that you know. If he suspects you are onto him, he will move the money again, likely to a jurisdiction where we can't touch it, or he will destroy evidence. You need to buy us time to freeze that offshore account. Can you do that? Can you look him in the eye and pretend he is still your loving son?" The thought made my stomach turn. To break bread with the man who had just stabbed me in the back? To let him kiss my cheek? But then I thought about the arrogance in his voice. She's pathetic in her devotion. I sat up straighter, smoothing the wrinkles in my skirt. "Yes," I said, the word tasting like ash. "I can do it." The drive back to my house was a blur of mental preparation. I entered through the front door, calling out a cheerful hello that sounded surprisingly steady. Julian was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine for Monica. They looked the picture of domestic bliss, celebrating a secret victory. "Mom, you're back," Julian said, turning with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We were just wondering where you went." I realized I left my sunglasses at the pharmacy. I lied smoothly. My brain was firing on all cylinders now. I had to be the naive, forgetful mother they needed me to be. My memory is getting so terrible lately. I swear, I'd lose my head if it wasn't attached. Monica exchanged a quick, satisfied glance with Julian. "Oh, Eleanor, don't worry," she cooed, walking over to touch my arm. "It happens to everyone. You have so much on your mind. That's why it's so good Julian is handling the finances now. One less thing for you to stress about." The touch of her hand felt like a brand, but I forced a grateful smile. "You are right, dear. I don't know what I would do without you two." Dinner was an exercise in torture. I sat across from them, eating roast chicken, listening to them talk about their upcoming vacation to the Caribbean. "We really need a break," Julian said, carving the meat. "Work has been so stressful. We were thinking of checking out some properties while we are down there, maybe for a vacation home, something for the whole family to enjoy." For the whole family. The audacity was breathtaking. He was talking about buying a house with my stolen money, pretending it would be a communal sanctuary. "That sounds lovely," I said, taking a sip of water to wash down the bile. "You two work so hard. You deserve it." Inside, I was screaming. I was cataloging every interaction from the last 6 months. The way Julian had pressured me to sign the power of attorney documents when I was recovering from the flu, weak and foggy. "It's just for emergencies, Mom. If you're in the hospital, who will pay the bills?" The way Monica had started asking probing questions about my investment portfolio. I had interpreted it as interest in my life. Now I saw it was an inventory of assets. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I felt violated in the sanctuary of my own home. But alongside the pain, a cold fury was building. I was Eleanor Vance. I had managed construction crews of 200 men who didn't want to take orders from a woman. I had navigated recessions and market crashes. I would not be outsmarted by a son who had never worked a day of hard manual labor in his life. The next morning, I left the house at 8 a.m. sharp. I told Julian I was going to the garden center. Instead, I drove straight to the downtown branch of First National Bank. I had an appointment with Mr. Henderson, the senior branch manager who had handled my accounts for 20 years. When I sat down in his office, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I need a full audit of my accounts, Mr. Henderson. Specifically, any transfers made in the last 48 hours using the power of attorney credentials held by Julian Vance. Mr. Henderson looked at me, his brow furrowing. Mrs. Vance, is something wrong? Julian called yesterday to authorize a wire. He said it was for a real estate investment you were making together. I felt a fresh wave of betrayal, but I kept my voice level. I did not authorize that investment. I need to know where the money went. Now. Mr. Henderson's face went pale. He typed furiously on his keyboard, his eyes darting back and forth. Mrs. Vance, this is significant. $450,000 was wired to a shell company account in the Cayman Islands. The entity is listed as Aurora Holdings. Aurora. That was the name of Monica's childhood cat. The lack of creativity was almost insulting. Freeze everything, I commanded. Revoke the power of attorney immediately. I want a stop order on that wire if it hasn't fully settled at the receiving bank. And I need printed records of every transaction Julian has made in the last 6 months. While Mr. Henderson scrambled to execute the orders, I called Lydia. It's confirmed, I said into the phone. Cayman Islands, Aurora Holdings. Good, Lydia replied. I have already contacted a forensic accountant and a friend of mine in the district attorney's office. His name is Detective Silas Thorne, my nephew. He specializes in elder financial fraud. Go to the station. He is expecting you. The police station was a stark contrast to the quiet luxury of my bank. It smelled of stale coffee and ozone. Detective Thorne was a sharp-featured man in his 40s with intense eyes that seemed to see right through the polite facade I usually maintained. He listened to my story, reviewing the documents Mr. Henderson had printed out. When he looked up, his expression was grim. This is a classic smash and grab, Mrs. Vance, Thorne said. But usually, they wait until the victim is more incapacitated. They got greedy. The amount is large enough to trigger federal scrutiny, but moving it offshore that quickly, they are trying to hide it before you notice. Can we get it back? I asked, my hands trembling in my lap. We have a chance, Thorne said. Because you caught it within 24 hours, we can petition the intermediate bank to flag the transaction as fraudulent. But we need to move fast. And we need to build a criminal case against them to ensure the Cayman authorities cooperate. He paused, pulling a file from his desk. There is something else you should know. When Lydia told me the names, I ran a background check on your daughter-in-law, Monica Vance, née Geller. He slid a photo across the desk. It was a mugshot from 10 years ago. Monica looked younger, her hair a different color, but the cold eyes were the same. Her real name is Monica Street James. She has a history. 2 previous marriages to men with elderly, wealthy parents. In both cases, the parents' assets were drained, and the marriages dissolved shortly after the money was gone. She was never convicted because the victims were too ashamed to testify, or they had passed away before the investigation concluded. The room spun. Julian wasn't just a thief, he was a pawn. He had married a professional predator. She's playing him, I whispered. Likely. Thorne nodded. But that doesn't absolve him. He signed the transfer orders. He is the one betraying your trust. Mrs. Vance, to catch them, we need them to believe they have succeeded. We need them to feel safe enough to access that offshore account, so we can trace the IP and confirm their control over the stolen funds. So, I have to continue the charade? For 2 more days, Thorne said. We need you to wear a wire. We need a confession on tape that implicates them in the intent to defraud. We need them to admit that the transfer wasn't a bad investment, but a calculated theft. Walking out of the station, I felt a heavy weight settle in my gut. I was about to entrap my own son. But then I remembered the mugshot. I remembered Elias. Wait, I haven't mentioned Elias. While I was waiting in the lobby for Detective Thorne to copy some files, an older gentleman had been sitting on the bench next to me. He looked hollowed out, his suit expensive, but hanging loosely on his frame. He had noticed my shaking hands and offered me a peppermint. We started talking. His name was Arthur Sterling. He was there to follow up on a case from 4 years ago. My son, Arthur had told me, his voice devoid of hope. He took the house, the pension, everything. I live in a state-subsidized apartment now. I come here once a month just to see if they found him. They never do. Arthur's eyes haunted me. They were the eyes of a man who had died while his body kept living. He was the ghost of my future if I didn't fight. I wasn't just doing this for the money anymore. I was doing it for Arthur and for every parent who had been discarded like trash by the children they raised. The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and acting. I wore a small recording device pinned inside my cardigan. I played the role of the doting mother perfectly. I cooked their favorite meals. I asked about their trip. On the second evening, I decided to spring the trap. We were in the living room. Julian was scrolling through his tablet, looking smug. Julian, I said, feigning a confused innocence. I was trying to log into the retirement account today to check on the dividends, but it said the balance was 0. Is there a glitch in the system? The room went silent. Monica froze mid-sip of her wine. Julian looked up, his face composing itself into a mask of concern. Oh, Mom, I meant to tell you, he said, his voice smooth as silk. We moved the funds to a new high-yield portfolio. The old interface won't show it. It's much more secure. You don't need to worry about it. But 0? I pressed, letting a tremor enter my voice. It scares me, Julian. That's everything I have. Are you sure it's safe? Julian stood up and walked over to me, kneeling by my chair. He took my hand, the hand that had bandaged his knees and paid for his tuition, and looked me in the eye. Mom, trust me. I did it to protect you. You know you're not as sharp with these things as you used to be. It's all safe. Monica and I are watching it like hawks. It's better this way. You don't need the stress of managing that kind of money. From the corner of the room, Monica chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. Exactly, Eleanor. We just want you to relax. We've got the money under control. It's practically ours to manage anyway, considering, well, the future. There it was, the confession, the admission of control, the gaslighting, the intent. I felt the recording device warm against my chest. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and realized that the boy I loved was gone. He had been consumed by greed and a woman who played on his weakness. Thank you, Julian, I said softly. I understand now. And I did. I understood perfectly. The takedown happened the next morning. I had arranged for Julian and Monica to come over for brunch. I told them I had a surprise for them. When they arrived, the table was set. But instead of pancakes, there were 3 file folders on the table. Sit down, I said, my voice devoid of the wavering tone I had adopted for the last few days. It was my command voice, the voice that moved steel beams and concrete. Julian looked confused. Mom, what is this? Sit down, I repeated, harder this time. They sat. I walked over to the sidebar and poured myself a cup of coffee, taking a long, deliberate sip. I know about Aurora Holdings, I said calmly. The color drained from Julian's face so fast it looked like he might faint. Monica, however, narrowed her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, Eleanor. You're confused again. Stop it, Monica, I snapped. The act is over. I know about the transfer. I know about the Cayman account. And I know about your previous husbands, Monica Street James. Monica stood up, knocking her chair back. This is ridiculous. Julian, let's go. Your mother is having an episode. She's not having an episode, a deep voice said from the kitchen doorway. Detective Thorne stepped out, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Lydia walked in from the hallway, looking like the angel of vengeance in a Chanel suit. Julian Vance, Monica Vance, Thorne said, holding up a warrant. You are under arrest for wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The chaos that ensued was pathetic. Julian started crying immediately, blubbering about how it was a mistake, how he was just borrowing it. Monica, realizing the game was up, turned on him instantly. It was his idea, she shrieked as the officer cuffed her. He told me his mother was senile. He wanted the money for the house. I stood by the window, watching them being led away. Julian looked back at me before they pushed him into the cruiser. Mom, please, tell them I was just helping you. I held his gaze, my face a mask of stone. I said nothing. I let the silence be his answer. The legal proceedings took 6 months. The recording I had made was the nail in the coffin. Combined with the forensic evidence of the wire transfer and Monica's past history, the case was airtight. Because I had acted so quickly, the bank was able to recall the wire transfer before it fully cleared the offshore hurdles. I got the money back, all of it, minus some legal fees. But the courtroom sentencing was the hardest day of my life. I sat in the front row, flanked by Lydia and Arthur Sterling, who had come to support me. Julian looked broken. Prison orange did not suit him. He had lost weight, and the arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a terrified vulnerability. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood up. I walked to the podium, my hands steady this time. I looked at Monica, who was staring at the table, and then at Julian, who was weeping silently. My son, I began, my voice echoing in the quiet courtroom, believes that because he is my blood, he was entitled to the fruit of my labor. He believed that my age diminished my worth. He believed that love is a transaction. I took a breath. I raised him to be a man of honor. Somewhere along the way, he chose a different path. I do not hate him. Hate requires energy I no longer wish to spend on him. But I will not save him. To save him now would be to confirm his belief that I am a resource to be used, not a person to be respected. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, I ask for justice. Not for revenge, but for the affirmation that the elderly are not prey. We are not ghosts in our own lives. Julian was sentenced to 5 years. Monica, with her prior history now brought to light, got 8. In the year that followed, I sold the big house. It held too many ghosts. I moved into a sleek, modern condo in the city, closer to the art galleries and theaters I loved. I started a foundation with Arthur Sterling. We provide legal and forensic accounting support for elderly people who suspect they are being financially abused by family members. We call it the Vance Sterling Initiative. It gave Arthur a new lease on life. He smiles now. He has purpose. I visited Julian in prison only once, a month ago. We spoke through the glass. Why? He asked me, his eyes hollow. Why did you do it, Mom? You could have just asked for the money back. You didn't have to send me here. I looked at the man who was still, in some painful way, my little boy. If I had just taken the money back, Julian, you would have waited until I was older, until I was weaker, and you would have done it again, and you would have done it to others. But I'm your son, he whispered. And I am your mother, I replied softly. And a mother's job is to teach her child right from wrong, even if the lesson comes 30 years too late. I stood up and placed my hand against the glass. I hope you find yourself in here, Julian, because the man who walked into my house that day, I don't know him, and I don't want to know him. I walked out of the prison into the bright, crisp autumn air. The leaves were turning gold and crimson, a beautiful reminder that change is inevitable, and that there is a profound beauty in letting go of what is dead to make room for what is alive. I had lost a son. Yes, the grief would always be there, a quiet ache in the background of my days. But I had saved myself. I had reclaimed my narrative. I was not a victim. I was Eleanor Vance, and for the first time in a long time, my life belonged entirely to me.